Before we get started, just a reminder to please silence your cell phones. And I also just wanted to let you know about a couple of other events coming up soon. Starting this Saturday, we have legal and financial planning workshops set up for journalists at any level of their career. You do not have to be a member of the FCC to attend. They'll be talking about all kinds of areas of the law that pertain to the work of journalism, and also some tips for how journalists can plan for their financial future, which we're not often very good at, so it's worth considering attending. And then on Monday, we have a film screening. It's called Scandal, Bringing Down Wirecard. And it's a Netflix feature documentary about a team of investigative journalists at the Financial Times unraveling fraud at Wirecard, the fintech company. We'll be joined by Zoom. We'll be joined via Zoom by Dan McCrum, who was part of the investigations team. And then finally, we have another book talk coming up on Wednesday, February 1st. The book is called Political Censorship in British Hong Kong, and that is with Dr. Michael Eng from HKU. So for today, we're very pleased to welcome Uther Charlton-Stevens. He is an FCC member who grew up right here in Hong Kong, and he is the author of Anglo-India and the End of Empire. This is a topic that he has been researching for 15 years, and this is his second book on the topic, and it's one that he has a personal connection to as well, which he will tell you about. So come on up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, yes, this topic, if you came to one of the previous FCC events last year, there was a very fascinating documentary called Blurring the Color Line, Chinese in the Segregated South, with Crystal Kwok speaking to us. And I think that there are some similar themes in my topic, which is this sort of theme of being in between and the idea of there being a kind of racial binary, a polarity between two groups, in the American case, between predominantly white America and black America, and then how the Chinese fit in the middle of that. So another of these in-between groups, which has a long history in Asia, distinct in each country, in each former colony, such as Hong Kong, Singapore, colonial Malaya, Burma, and India, are groups that we would know as Eurasians in Hong Kong. And the community that I'm talking about here in India was also known as Eurasian, but they changed their name to Anglo-Indian in 1911 in the census, and that reflected their identification with Britain. So the title of the book, Anglo-India and the End of Empire, this word Anglo-India, it refers to a sort of concept of an imagined space which originally was associated with the British in India. So the British originally called themselves Anglo-Indians, but this term Anglo-Indians was appropriated by the mixed race group because they identified strongly with Britain. So the map that I've got up at the moment just gives us a reminder of the vastness of the British Empire, and how Hong Kong was just one tiny little red or pink speck on this map. And the center of that empire was the British Raj in India, which included what is now India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Burma, although Sri Lanka was a separate colony. Here's another map which shows you the political divisions under British rule, including yellow areas which were governed indirectly as princely states with maharajas and nawabs who had a limited degree of autonomy under British rule, and the red, pink areas were the directly British administered territories deriving from the three company presidencies of Madras, Bengal, and Bombay. And of course, you can see the map also includes Burma. And This is a map which shows the prevailing religious boundaries during the British period, just as neat lines. Of course, this was a blended spectrum where you had minorities that overlapped. But you can see that the green areas were the predominantly Muslim majority areas which would become Pakistan, the two divided parts of Pakistan, East Pakistan and West Pakistan, which later split into Pakistan and Bangladesh. And you can also see that Burma is obviously distinct because of its majority Buddhist religion. These are pictures of, on the left-hand side, a typical Anglo-Indian family early in the 20th century in South India, close to what is now Chennai, or Madras as it was then. And on the right side, here's a similar family portrait of an Anglo-Burmese family. So I'm mainly talking about the Anglo-Indians, and that is what the book is about. But there were interesting connections between Anglo-Indians and other Eurasian and mixed race groups across Asia. So perhaps that's a topic we could develop in questions and answers. There's a lot of research that's gone into my PhD and then my first and second book on this subject, and a wide range of different source materials. I did conduct interviews myself in India and in Australia because this community is part of a worldwide diaspora extending mainly across the English-speaking countries. But I heavily rely on old-fashioned archival documentation. So this is a source from 1830, which shows, beautiful handwritten primary documents that I've been working with, and also a lot of magazines and journals and newspapers from the time. I find that the diaries, memoirs, and published books of journalists have been quite an interesting supplementary source for this work as well. This is another Anglo-Indian family, the Friss-Brown family, and they also were in South India, as was my own family, my own family came from Bangalore on my father's side. And you can see in this picture something important that I have to explain, often even to fellow scholars in race studies, that in mixed families, it's quite usual for people, including immediate siblings, to be of different complexions. So you can see that these sisters and their mother cover the color spectrum. That's even apparent, although it's a black and white photograph, and with black and white photos, you can't always tell very clearly what someone's ethnicity is. That comes to some of the famous cases that I explore in the book. On the left-hand side is a globally famous man of the early 20th century who was known as Boris Karloff. And he adopted this name in order to pursue a film career in Hollywood, and was very famous as Frankenstein's monster and Imhotep in The Mummy, and a series of mad scientist roles and villainous characters, so that he is regarded as one of the greatest horror stars of the 20th century. And on the right-hand side is his brother, Sir John Pratt, who was the consul general, the British consul general in Shanghai. And although he could pass as European in some contexts, he was referred to by the Chinese consular staff as the Black Consul. So the real name of Boris Karloff was William Henry Pratt, and he changed his name to a Russian-sounding name because that made him more ethnically and racially ambiguous, and so it allowed him to pursue a Hollywood film career with greater ease. In the US, especially in many of the southern states, there were laws against interracial marriage, which were upheld until the Supreme Court ruling in Loving versus Virginia in 1967. So one of the themes is that in terms of the films that I highlight in the book, is how many actors and actresses from mixed backgrounds had to try and pass as white or European in order to pursue their film careers, in order to take on romantic lead roles in films. So this is, again, Sir John Pratt at a Boy Scout parade in Shanghai in the 1920s. And these are the four brothers Pratt. There were more brothers, but this is the largest gathering. And you can see their slightly different complexions. So depending on the company they were in, some might have passed as European. And they were all able, their one brother, of course, was a film star, but the other brothers were all very successful in the British Foreign Service, diplomatic corps, or in the ICS and the judiciary in India. So here's the cover of the book, which features Merle Oberon in the private life of Henry VIII, which was her breakout role in 1933. And it's a family folk story. I don't know if it's true, that my great uncle married one of Merle Oberon's cousins. So Merle was, I think, quite obviously to us, a mixed lady who doesn't look entirely white. I don't think that's an understatement. But there was a contrivance at both London Films and in Hollywood to present her to the cinema-going public as a purely British woman who had been born in Tasmania in Australia, in Hobart, which was also the birthplace of another film star of the era, Errol Flynn. And because she was willing to go along with this and to fictionalize her own biography with the help of the film studios and publicists and maintain this fiction through her life, she was able to star in leading romantic roles in Hollywood alongside other big A-listers like Douglas Fairbanks and Sir Laurence Olivier and Leslie Howard. So her film success was dependent upon that. Some of you may have heard that recently in the US, Anna May Wong, famous Chinese-American film actress, was put onto the American coins. And that was possible. That is a celebration of her very successful film career. But for her, she was not able to take on romantic roles because of the anti-miscegenation laws in the US and because it's clear that she was Chinese. So the comparison between Anna May Wong's career and Merle's career, which I discuss in the introduction, shows us how passing as white, attempting to depict yourself as European, even if it was a thinly veiled pretense, transformed your life opportunities in that era, especially in the United States, but in the Western film industry more generally. So here's another famous star of the screen from the same era, born in Darjeeling. I think some of you may recognize this lady as Vivian Leigh. She also was from a mixed background. Her mother was from an Armenian Catholic family, and their name was Yakji. And when her British father married her mother, he was forced to resign from the Bengal Club, which is the Indian equivalent, or the Bengal equivalent of the Hong Kong Club, and also the Saturday Club, because it was not acceptable for him to marry somebody whose surname was Yakji. And according to the family's own stories about itself, on her mother's father's side, they were Yakjis, Armenians, they acknowledged that. But on her mother's side, they maintained that the family was Irish. But they came from a kind of orphanage hill station background, which I argue in the book was a typical environment where many mixed-race children of all different complexions would be found. So it's highly likely that as well as being mixed and partly Armenian, that they were also partly Anglo-Indian. This is a Boy Scouts group from South India, from Bangalore. And I've just shown this picture to get a sense of how the way that this group in India, we can come to comparisons between Hong Kong Eurasians and Anglo-Indians in India later, but the way that this group's identity developed in India was very pro-British and very aligned with the colonial state. This was partly because they got employment on the railways and in the telegraphs in these strategically sensitive areas, and their education was very Britain-orientated. That's reflected in the fact that although they were restricted from fighting in the army since the 1790s, during the First World War and the Second World War, these rules were relaxed, and it was possible for them to enter into direct military units, such as the Anglo-Indian force that served in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, during the First World War. Here is a map which shows the geographical extent of the Anglo-Indian community. It was really an all-India community spread across the country and into Burma as well. So you can see there are 88 branches of the political organization that was set up to represent this mixed race group. And on the right, we have an advert for the Women's Auxiliary Corps India, which was a military unit during the Second World War in which my grandmother was an officer, and which also features in the book and film Bawani Junction that I'm going to come to. So in the center of this picture is my grandmother. Virginia Mary DeVaz was her maiden name. Her married name was Stevens. And this is the DeVaz family, so my great-grandparents on my grandmother's side, and my grandmother to the far right of this picture. However, if you look at this other photo of her, the photo that she liked the most with her husband, they could both pass together as being European, and her husband certainly looked European. My grandfather, Edward Aloysius Stevens, though when he died quite young, she put on his gravestone his mother's maiden name as well, Rosemary Stevens, as his surname. And I believe that on the Rosemary side that the family was definitely mixed and Anglo-Indian. So on the right-hand side here is my grandfather again in his dress uniform, and on the left-hand side is my great-uncle, who was a medical doctor in the army and in the Indian Army, and he's rumored to have married one of Merle Oberon's cousins. So here is a picture of a expedition from the telegraph department in India into Tibet, and the man standing up on the right-hand side is Willoughby Patrick Rosemere, who I think you can identify from this photo as being a person of color, as we would say, a mixed-race man. So he is from the Rosemere side of my grandfather's family. So for me, that confirms that they were also mixed. And here are the covers of the book Bawani Junction and the film version of Bawani Junction. So the book was written in 1954 and was a bestseller, and the film was made 2 years later in 1956, starring Ava Gardner and Stuart Granger. And I think that this is the most direct, famous depiction of Anglo-Indians and their dilemma at the end of empire, how they felt torn and conflicted between their own mixed identity and the demands of Indian nationalism and their affiliation to the British Empire, and how they navigated the painful process for them of independence. So I think this book my book gives a perspective which is not the usual perspective, because it is not the perspective of the colonizers or the colonized. It's a perspective of a group of people in between who were associated with the colonial power and who faced the problem of many minorities after independence, of adjusting to the new conditions brought about by independence. And in this book and the film version of it, this is symbolized by the choices that Victoria Jones, also a Women's Auxiliary Corps WAC-I subaltern, has to make. Her romantic choices are a metaphor for the identity dilemma that this community faced at the end of empire. So she either can have a romance with the Anglo-Indian boy next door, a railwayman called Patrick Taylor, who represents her own community, something familiar, but he expresses lots of racial prejudice towards Indians, and he shows himself to be very unready for the prospect of independence and a government run by Indians. And her alternatives are a British colonel, Colonel Savage, who represents a possible escape from India and from her Anglo-Indian position, being caught in between the British and the Indians, which would have been regarded as an elevation by members of her group, to sort of marry a British man and then be taken away from the difficulties of the mixed race position and facing prejudice from both the British community and the Indian community. While she also flirts with a romance with a Sikh railwayman who gives her a completely different choice, which is to become an Indian nationalist. But he tells her that her name Victoria, as the name of the late Queen Empress, is very unsuitable for an Indian, so she should change her name. And he also wants her to change her religion and become a Sikh. So that proves a bridge too far. And one of the interesting things is that the book ending and the film ending, in terms of what she chooses, are different. In the book, she ends up with the Anglo-Indian railwayman, which perhaps would seem the natural outcome to many people at the time. Whereas in the film, it follows a sort of Hollywood convention that the white hero always gets the girl, and she ends up with the British Colonel Savage. And the Anglo-Indian railwayman dies a heroic death, which conveniently removes him from the picture. So it's interesting. I discuss how those two alternative endings can be read in terms of their meaning, and the identity of John Masters as to whether he himself might have been mixed features into how you regard those two endings. So I'm going to round it off there, but what I want to say is that the film of this was 1956, and there's a very large poster in the stairwell of the FCC of another film from the year before called Love is a Many Splendored Thing. And in that film, Jennifer Jones plays the real-life character Han Soo-yin, which was her pen name. Her real name was Jo Guang-hu, and she was a Hong Kong Eurasian medical doctor born in China who had a fascinating life, of which just one episode was her romance with an FCC journalist called Ian Morrison, who died in the Korean War in 1950. So that film is an interesting counterpoint. There's been some suggestion that it might be screened at the FCC at some point. An interesting counterpoint to compare Bawani Junction with Love is a Many Splendored Thing, and that perhaps is a window into comparing the position of Eurasians in Hong Kong with the mixed Anglo-Indian community in India. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I'll just start off with a couple of questions, and then we'll throw it open to the audience. First, could you just give us a sense of how large the Anglo-Indian community was over time, and also how it developed after the end of British rule?
Yes, so the Anglo-Indian community might, around independence, 1947, might have been between 200,000 and 250,000 people. They were recorded in the census, but the census figures were never entirely accurate. And one of the unfortunate things about the community's position in India since independence is that they ceased to be recorded in the census after independence. So we didn't have a reliable count. And very large numbers of Anglo-Indians from this original 200 to 250,000 group migrated to Britain primarily, and then secondarily to Australia, and smaller numbers to New Zealand and Canada. So it's now a worldwide diaspora, and disproportionately it was the poorer and less well-qualified Anglo-Indians who remained in India. And each part of this diaspora has continued to evolve over time.
And I also wanted to ask how the Anglo-Indian experience in India compares to that of Eurasian communities elsewhere in Asia.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So I'll try and talk a bit about the Hong Kong experience. So the Anglo-Indian group had a much longer history than the Hong Kong Eurasian community. And because British rule in India was a much longer period, and you already had the origins of this group going back to the 16th and 17th century. So the Anglo-Indian community developed into a group that married within its own ranks and formed a separate community and was recognized from quite early on in the census. And then it became also recognized in the constitutions during the colonial period and in India's first post-independence constitution. Whereas in Hong Kong, you had very important Eurasian individuals and families, famously Sir Robert Hotong, who was the richest person in Hong Kong at the time. But he chose to identify as Chinese. And I think this is partly because Chinese attitudes to people who are mixed were significantly different on a religious and cultural basis to Indian Hindu attitudes to people who are mixed, that women who married or cohabited with Europeans in India tended to be ejected from their caste community, whereas mixed people in Hong Kong had more range of possibilities and tended to be more connected to both sides of their ancestry and their community. It's not to say that Hong Kong Eurasians didn't face prejudice. They faced some prejudice both from the Chinese community and the British community. But in the early period, a lot of them chose to identify with their Chinese side of their family and use Chinese names because that was seen as more beneficial to them at the time. Then in the 1920s and the interwar years, the Hong Kong Eurasian community actually started to coalesce into more of a group. And although Sir Robert Hotong identified as Chinese primarily, he was very involved in endowing a charitable organization that would try and support poor Eurasians in Hong Kong. So there was a sort of an early development of a sort of communal identity for Eurasians in Hong Kong, but it was a much more embryonic thing and less historically long-standing than in India.
Let's take some questions from the audience. Please identify yourself. Let's start over here.
Bob Meyer from FarmerLink. I was intrigued by the Merle Oberon slide, which showed a headline saying she was the daughter of her sister. You intriguingly did not get into that. Can you explain what that was about?
Yes. So this was a story that was deeply buried until a documentary was made by a filmmaker called Delovsky. Earlier biographers didn't pick this up, that the woman that she knew as her mother was actually her biological grandmother. So the woman she knew to be her mother had one daughter, and the daughter then had some kind of abusive relationship with one of her mother's partners who was European. And Merle was unfortunately the child of that, although the way that it was hidden or concealed was that, just as in days of yore, you might send a pregnant girl off to live with some cousins and then, suddenly show up with a younger sister. In this case, it was smoothed over in a similar way, that her sister was, her sister was actually her mother, but was treated as if she was her older sister.
Let's stay at the same table and then we'll move over.
Hello, Stephen Anderson, retired. The question I've got is about identity. So you talked about identity of Anglo-Indian communities, whether the Anglo-Indian community in India tended to identify differently in terms of align with Britain or with India versus Anglo-Indian communities outside India.
Yes, so when independence came, the Anglo-Indian leader who took over in 1942, Frank Anthony, realized that the British were not going to secure the post-independence future of the community, that they were not going to be able to do anything under an Indian government to safeguard the economic, employment, educational interests of this group. So there was a strong sense of betrayal within this community, and he titled his book Britain's Betrayal in India. And he reorientated himself towards the Indian nationalists, and I discuss in the book how he had meetings with Gandhi, Nehru, and Sardar Patel, and this resulted in special constitutional measures being brought in for the Anglo-Indian community in India, which lasted until the current government removed them in 2019. And under those measures, there were special nominated seats in the central parliament and in a lot of the state regional parliaments, legislatures. So the history of the community in post-independence India was to become an Indian nationalist minority, sort of like hopefully a model minority within the Indian nation. But parts of the diaspora, like my family, left to go to Britain because they didn't want to accept becoming Indian nationals. That was part of it. They identified strongly with their English language, with being Christian, which vast majority of Anglo-Indians were, and so they were more comfortable in trying to migrate to and integrate into the Anglophone countries that were Christian, like Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada.
Hi, I'm To Han Shi from Singapore. Under British colonial rules, were the Anglo-Indians given, roughly speaking, jobs below the level of the white British but above the level of the Indians? And was that also true for the Eurasians in Hong Kong? And was that also true for the Eurasians in my country, Singapore, under British colonial rule?
Yes, yes. I mean, like, the big picture is yes. If I go into the details, I can tell you, like, the nuances of that. But effectively, there were reserved jobs in the railways, the telegraphs, the customs services, and these were all quite strategically sensitive areas for the Raj. So the railways, apart from the army, the railways were the most important way that the British were able to govern India. They had to be able to move troops around. Transport and communications for the army were very important. So when there was Indian nationalist violent agitation, in not the Gandhian model, but sabotage, they would try and derail trains or cut the telegraph lines. So this group was perceived to be loyal, so they were given this intermediary position, and their salaries generally tended to be in the middle also. And this was, I think, less formalized in Hong Kong and in Singapore, but it was very similar, that de facto in private companies and government services, mixed people tended to be given middle-level positions, and definitely Eurasians in Hong Kong and in Singapore were given higher salary scales than Malays or Hong Kong Chinese.
Other questions? Is there anyone in the back I'm not seeing? Oh, yes, over there.
Hi, Renata Borner, also retired. I'm wondering how this compares to like the Dutch East Indies and what the difference experience would be under another colonizer.
So that's also a very interesting question. I know less about Java, Batavia, the Dutch East Indies than I do about Sri Lanka, which was originally Portuguese, then Dutch, and then British. But as a result of the previous Dutch rule, there was a mixed race group there who had their own designation, which was burghers. And because the Dutch gave the burghers higher civic and legal status and greater connection to Dutch citizenship than the Anglo-Indian community in India had, the British took over a colony where the mixed group there had a sort of higher position than the Anglo-Indians in India. So I don't think you could say that the French or the Dutch or the Portuguese were completely wonderful and inclusive towards their mixed race populations, but they were, on the whole, better in their treatment of these mixed groups. And so the burghers had a higher sense of self-esteem and status within the colonial world, even during the British period. And coming back to the Singapore and Malaysia, some Anglo-Indians and some Burghers from Sri Lanka migrated to Kuala Lumpur and to Singapore, and they still held themselves as slightly above the other Eurasian groups, including Anglo-Indians and including partly Malay or partly Chinese Eurasians, even though these communities lived together socially and intermarried with one another.
Other questions? One question I had, in the book you quote someone who describes the Anglo-Indian community as more British than the British. Can you explain what that means?
So, I mean, that's a sort of a quip that, like, other Indian communities often express about the Anglo-Indians. They had a sort of sense that the Anglo-Indians were pretending to be more British than the British, that they insisted on being British. And there was also a sense that while some colonial British people were interested in Indian art and culture and music, the Anglo-Indians were often fervently, during the colonial period, fervently insistent that they were not interested in Indian music or culture or art or, you know, the poems of Tagore. So this sort of sense that the Anglo-Indians were actually a somewhat hybridized culture. They had some cultural inheritance from the Indian side, but because of the way the community emerged and its educational system, they were primarily English, they were completely English-speaking, that was their mother tongue, and they were primarily culturally orientated towards the West. So there was a sort of criticism from the other Indian communities that they were aping Europeans, but it was actually part of their own cultural inheritance that they perhaps wanted to emphasize or exaggerate in certain conflicts with other Indian communities.
Oh, yes, and we have a question in the back. Oh, and then we'll go back to, yeah.
Thank you. My name is John Antweiler. I'm retired as well. A very interesting talk. Thank you very much. I'm wondering, the Anglo-Indian diaspora, you didn't mention that there was much immigration or integration with Hong Kong. Did that happen at all? And if so, what has happened to that community?
So I do know at least one Anglo-Indian who's not from my own family who lives in Hong Kong, and he came to my first book talk at the Helen at May. And I do think that there was some migration of Anglo-Indians to other British colonies. Like, I know that my great-uncle moved to Africa first before he migrated to the UK, and some Anglo-Indians went to Malaysia. But I don't think that many Anglo-Indians reached Hong Kong. I think that for those who migrated to other British colonies in Asia, it was a sense of continuing their lifestyle in a similar setting. But aspirationally, most of them wanted to migrate to Britain or Australia. And that was because many of them imagined Britain to be their home. Like, even when they had multiple generations, they still thought of England as their home and talked about it as their home. Of course, that changed with the community that stayed in India when the leader, Frank Anthony, tried to get them to embrace India as their homeland and become Indian nationalists. But the colonial era Anglo-Indians were very much minded to go to England. Of course, when some of them did go there, they didn't much like the weather. They didn't find it as familiar and welcoming as they expected. And some went to Australia and some remigrated to Australia, having first migrated to Britain, because they found that the climate was more conducive. And there was such a concentration of Anglo-Indians who settled in Western Australia in Perth, where there was a direct P&O line from India that arrived in the port abutting Perth, that there they maintained the strongest sense of a community identity within these countries, whereas in Britain, a lot of Anglo-Indians sort of went to ground, they blended into the society. So there's a lot of famous people in Britain who've done these ancestry programs like Who Do You Think You Are? And they do DNA and genealogical research. And people like Billy Connolly and the musician, Scottish musician Alistair McGowan on this program, and another very famous Hollywood star whose name escapes me, they've all discovered that they have Anglo-Indian roots.
Yeah, we have another question.
I'm just wondering, after the Japanese were defeated in World War II, and there was a shortage of Allied troops to actually go into Asian countries that had been occupied, were the Anglo-Indian forces deployed? And if they were, what was the response to them?
I'm going to hijack that question, if you don't mind, because I don't have an example that exactly fits that. But the issue of the Japanese during World War II is a very interesting one, because the Japanese treated mixed people quite badly relative to Chinese or Malays or Indians. They singled them out, generally speaking, for ill treatment. But that resulted in Hong Kong in some people who are Eurasian completely passing as Chinese in order to escape being interned with the British. And generally speaking, Eurasians in Hong Kong were not interned, nor were they interned generally in Singapore. Whereas when the Japanese got to Burma, all those Anglo-Indians and Anglo-Burmans who remained there, the Eurasian groups from India and Burma, who didn't trek out, were interned by the Japanese. And they were suspected for their pro-British sympathies, and that they would be potential collaborators or resistors to the Japanese occupation.
We have time for another question, I think, if anyone has anything left. Oh, yes.
Hi, Shirley Durkin, I guess retired. Did the proclivity towards, for Anglo-Indians, towards wanting to be at home in the UK depend on which parent was, or which side of the family the Anglo came down? So, if it was your father's side, you were more inclined to think that way, and not so much if it was your mum?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. So because in India this was a legally and constitutionally defined group, the group was actually defined in law as being of European male paternal descent. So there were mixed people who were from Indian maternal descent. And it's an issue that is very comparable to the situation in Hong Kong, because if your family name was Chinese or Indian, that would often affect your self-identification. Although in the Hong Kong case, people changed their names, or they maintained an English name and a Chinese name in order to choose their own strategies or ways that they wanted to identify in certain contexts. In the case of people who were the children of Indian fathers, they would usually have Indian surnames. And in those cases, they tended to merge back into the mainstream Indian society, even if there were kind of caste implications for interracial or interfaith unions in the Hindu community. Still, the leader of the Congress party, through the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty on the Congress side, they are mixed today because of Sonia Gandhi being Italian. So, and in Nehru's family at the time of independence, his brother also married an English woman. So there was mixing of elite Indians and including princely rulers with European women, primarily European women rather than Anglo-Indian women. And they have their own story, which doesn't really fit neatly into the story that I'm telling.
And just to wrap up, I wanted to ask if there was anything else you wanted to add, and also a question I'm trying to ask speakers now, since you often have good recommendations. What are you reading right now, or what have you read recently that you would recommend to our audience?
Well, because of the setting, and if you did find this topic interesting, there's quite an academic book by Emma Tang from MIT about Hong Kong Eurasians, mainland Chinese Eurasians, and the Chinese Eurasian experience in America. And that is quite a technical book, but it really dovetails quite well with my work, and you can then see the comparisons between Hong Kong Eurasians and Anglo-Indians much better. I have been rereading Paul Scott's The Raj Quartet recently, and having done a lot of research on India, I think that in some ways politically those books are a bit uncomfortable today, but I think that they were very deeply researched and meditated, and the more I reread them, the more I find that, as somebody who knows the history well, that they are incredibly well grounded in terms of looking at the the colonial British expatriate experience of the end of empire. So I would also recommend going back to the Raj Quartet. I think that a lot of people simply read Forster's A Passage to India because it's much shorter and more manageable, but to me, the Raj Quartet, although it's very long, it requires investment, is much more rewarding.
That's great. I have to add all these to my reading list. Okay, well, thank you so much for being here today. And we do have copies of the book over there for anyone who's interested. And yeah, we'll see you around the club.
Yeah, so the book is here today, and it's available at Bookazine, and you can also get it on amazon.com.co.uk and .in. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.